The war was supposed to last a month, maybe a year tops. At least, that's what the bright-eyed strategists at the United Terran Coalition had predicted when first contact with the Zenari Dominion went sideways. They're an empire in decline, they'd said. We've got adaptability and grit, they'd boasted. That was 200 years ago. Admiral Jonas Vance had lost count of how many times humanity had almost won. He also lost count of how many times they had definitely lost. At this point, it was less of a war and more of a really aggressive long-term relationship. One where the divorce papers kept getting burned, along with entire star systems. Right now, Vance was standing on the bridge of the Relentless, an aptly named battleship, watching a Zenari fleet form up in the distance. Again, his second-in-command, Captain Mara Lewis, stood beside him, arms crossed, looking deeply unimpressed. "Let me guess," she said. "They're here to discuss peace?" Vance let out a long sigh, rubbing his temples. "Of course. And by peace, they mean surrender everything and kindly extinguish our species." "I don't know, sir," she mused. "Maybe this time they'll offer complimentary snacks before the annihilation?" A chime interrupted their gallows humor, signaling an incoming transmission. On the view screen, a Zenari warlord appeared, tall, elegant, and radiating the smug superiority of a species that once ruled half the galaxy. His name was High Strategos Vectal, and Vance had met him before. Multiple times. "Ah, Admiral Vance," Vectal greeted, his voice as smooth as polished steel. "It is regrettable that we meet again under these circumstances." Vance raised an eyebrow. "Regrettable?" "Vectal, buddy, you've sent an entire armada to hover outside my front door. That's not regrettable. That's passive-aggressive home invasion." Vectal's lips curled in what the Zenari probably thought was a smile. It looked more like a predatory grimace. "The Dominion once again extends an offer of peace. Accept our rule, and your species will be accommodated." Lewis let out a low whistle. "Wow, so generous. Do we get matching collars? Or is that an extra fee?" Vectal's expression didn't change, but his tone sharpened. "You continue to resist. You are the only species in the galaxy that refuses to bow, despite centuries of evidence that it is the only logical course." Vance leaned back, folding his arms. "Yeah, we get that a lot. And that was the crux of it, wasn't it? The war had lasted so long that no one even remembered the exact reason it had started anymore. The Zenari saw humanity as a rogue species, a problem that needed solving. Humanity saw the Zenari as arrogant overlords who could go shove their demands where the nearest black hole wouldn't spit them back out. So the fighting continued. Always. Vectal exhaled through his nose. Impressive, given that Zenari technically didn't have nostrils. "We will give you one final chance." Vance tilted his head. "Is this the same final chance you gave us last cycle? Or the cycle before that? Because I gotta tell you, the expiration date on these ultimatums is getting real flexible." Vectal's patience finally cracked. "Then we will wipe you from existence." Vance turned to Lewis. "And there it is? Right on schedule," she replied. The transmission cut, and the fleet before them began to move. Vance sighed, rolling his shoulders. "All right, battle stations. Let's remind them why we're still here." Alarms blared as the crew snapped into action. The Relentless surged forward, weapons priming, engines burning hot. Outside, the void erupted into fire and fury. And so, the war that would never end raged on. Jonas Vance hadn't slept in 24 hours. Not that he could remember the last time he had a full night's rest. When you fought in a war that spanned multiple generations, sleep became a luxury you could only dream about. Pun intended. The bridge of the Relentless was bathed in a sickly green hue as alarms screeched in the background. Red lights blinked in sync with his pulse, and the hum of the ship's engines made the whole thing feel like a low-budget horror film. Vance squinted at the starfield ahead, watching as the Zenari fleet, again, took up positions like they had nothing better to do. "How many times has this been, Captain?" Vance asked, his voice raspy. "5, if you're counting the last 2 days," Mara Lewis replied. She was standing by the tactical display, arms crossed, Her face locked in that perpetually unimpressed look she wore when dealing with bureaucrats or alien warlords. The Zenari really know how to ruin a Tuesday, right? Vance rubbed his jaw. Have we tried talking to them? Offering them a fruit basket? Lewis shot him a side eye, her expression deadpan. I'm sure that would go over well. Maybe we can throw in a coupon for a free massage, too. Vance chuckled darkly, running a hand through his thinning hair. He didn't have the energy for humor, but it came out anyway. There was no use pretending it didn't. Humor was his armor now. The war had stripped away everything else, his faith, his ideals, his sleep schedule. But humor? Humor was a constant. If you couldn't laugh, what was left? Status on the fleet, Lieutenant? He asked, focusing on the holo display. Lieutenant Nix stood rigid at the comm station, his eyes scanning data streams at a speed that made Vance's head spin. Zenari are deploying their cruisers into formation. We're looking at a standard engagement. They'll try the same trick as last time. Surround us, disorient us, then break through with their heavy hitters. Sounds like a fun afternoon. Mara flipped a switch on her console. Ready weapons. Prepare for evasive maneuvers. Vance nodded, settling into his chair. It was the same dance every time. The Zenari had tactics they never strayed from, believing their superiority could overwhelm any foe. They'd been wrong about humanity before, and they'd keep being wrong. They'd throw their ships at Earth and its colonies, and humanity would keep swatting them down, over and over, with no end in sight. Engaging at full throttle, Captain, Nix called out. We're moving into their range now. Vance watched the Zenari fleet line up like well-practiced dancers, but it was the same show every time. The Zenari would try to confuse them with their superior numbers, then strike from the shadows. Predictable. Let's give them a reason to dance then, Vance muttered. Weapons primed, shields at maximum, Mara reported, her voice cool and professional. Despite everything, she was always calm in battle, as if she'd been born into it. Here they come, Nix warned, his voice suddenly tense. The first wave of Zenari ships appeared out of the darkness of space, massive hulls gleaming with ancient arrogance. Vance didn't flinch. He had seen this before. The Zenari thought their technology made them untouchable. But what they didn't account for was humanity's ability to learn, adapt, and, most importantly, surprise them. Open fire, Vance ordered. The Relentless shuddered as it unleashed its first salvo. The blast of energy cannon fire illuminated the dark expanse of space like a dying star. The Zenari ships staggered under the assault, shields flickering, hulls scarred, but they didn't falter. Damn it. They've got their shields up, Mara muttered, flipping through tactical options. We'll need to hit their weaker points. Vance didn't hesitate. Hit their engines. That'll slow them down. The Relentless fired again, sending a barrage of plasma bolts toward the Zenari flagship. The flagship's shield flared brightly before cracking under the pressure. Then came the silence. The enemy flagship staggered but didn't fall. They never did. The Zenari aren't the type to give up, are they? Mara said dryly. Not without a fight, Vance replied, his voice dark with a mix of admiration and frustration. Neither are we. As the Zenari regrouped, Vance felt the familiar weight of dread settle in his chest. They had been here before. He had fought these same battles 100 times. Maybe more. The Zenari's advanced technology, their superior numbers, and their tactics were designed to break humanity's spirit. But the Terrans had something the Zenari couldn't understand. Humanity fought like they had nothing to lose. Evasive maneuvers. Vance barked as the Zenari launched a retaliatory strike. The Relentless shuddered again as the hull reverberated under the impact of enemy fire. The shields held, but just barely. We can't keep this up forever, Nix said, his voice clipped with urgency. They're pushing us into their kill zone. Vance looked at the strategic map again. Another strike from the Zenari fleet would push them into a corner. If they didn't change tactics now, they'd be sitting ducks. But Vance had one card left to play. Captain, set course for their flagship. We're going in? He turned to Mara, a determined glint in his eye. I want a clear shot at their command center. We hit them hard enough, we break their morale. Mara's eyes flicked to the map, then to him. She didn't need to ask. She knew. Aye, sir. We're doing this. The Relentless roared to life, cutting through the battlefield at breakneck speed, dodging fire as Vance gripped the armrests of his chair. The Zenari were closing in, but humanity had never been afraid of a good challenge. "We're going to win this one, Mara," Vance said, leaning forward. Mara shot him a look that would have been humorous if the situation weren't so dire. "Sure, Vance. We've been winning for 200 years. What's one more victory?" Vance smiled grimly. "Maybe this time we'll make it stick." The final collision course was set, and humanity's stubbornness would have its say, once again. The war had become a way of life. And life, it seemed, had forgotten how to be anything else. Jonas Vance leaned against the railing of the observation deck, staring out at the endless black of space. A cup of what passed for coffee in the Terran fleet clasped loosely in his hand. It tasted like recycled plasma, hot and bitter, but at least it was still liquid. He took another sip, not because it was good, but because it was the only thing that still reminded him of normalcy. If you could call normal the fact that, in the span of 200 years, humanity had gone from colonies on a handful of worlds to an unyielding, unbroken military juggernaut. "Admiral," Mara Lewis's voice broke through his fog of thought. "We got a new batch of recruits on deck." Vance turned to her, a half-smile creeping onto his face. "New recruits? We're still making those?" "I know. They were born 3 generations after the war started. Most of them can't even remember Earth as it was." Vance leaned his head back, staring at the steel ceiling. "What do they think they're signing up for? Glory? Honor?" Mara shrugged, her usual confidence replaced by the weariness that had begun to color every human face in the fleet. "Probably just a paycheck and a way out of the recruitment lines on the colony planets. They're not exactly lining up for a chance to fight alien overlords." Vance chuckled, though it was devoid of humor. "Yeah, I suppose fighting aliens is more of a family tradition at this point. The war had been that generational. The soldiers who fought now were mostly clones, descendants, and those who'd been born and bred on the front lines. People like Vance, who'd fought for so long that their memories of peace were faded, like photographs left too long in the sun. And the newer soldiers, born in the war's shadow, had never known anything else. "Have you spoken to any of them?" Vance asked. "The recruits?" Mara nodded, a thin line forming across her brow. "I did, sir. Some of them are eager. A few even look at us like we're legends. But most of them, they don't know what they're walking into." Vance's gaze darkened. "No, they don't. The real cost of the war wasn't measured in ships destroyed or planets conquered. It was in the lives that had been spent, by soldiers, by civilians, by entire generations who had been raised with no other purpose than to fight. And somewhere in that constant struggle, humanity had lost itself. Some of them think we'll win soon," Mara said, almost as if to herself. "That there's an end in sight. A way to stop it." Vance snorted. "The only way to stop this war is to stop breathing. If we could win, we would have done it 100 years ago." He waved his hand, dismissing the idea. "You know how it goes. Zenari give us a victory, and we think it's over, only to find out they were just regrouping for the next round. It's like a bad joke that won't die." Mara's expression softened, and for a moment, she looked as tired as Vance felt. "We're never going to stop fighting, are we?" Vance took a long drag from his cup, his eyes drifting back to the stars outside. "I think we forgot how. Not just the war, but everything else. What else is there? We're born into it. We die in it. What happens when the fighting stops? What happens to people like us who don't know how to live without it?" Mara was quiet for a moment, and Vance could feel her thinking it through, the way she always did before speaking. "I think we're the last ones who could have remembered," she said almost too quietly. It was a truth that hung in the air like a choking smoke. Humanity's sense of purpose had been irrevocably tied to the war. The soldiers who fought in it didn't know how to turn off the aggression once the fighting stopped. Even if there was peace tomorrow, there'd be no place for them. No more enemies to destroy. No more battles to win. The war had erased any real sense of home, of identity, of meaning. Vance swallowed the last of his coffee and placed the cup down on the edge of the railing. "And now we're all too stubborn to stop." "Hell, I'm too stubborn to stop." Mara gave him a look, sharp, perceptive, and for a moment, there was a flicker of understanding between them. She had seen it in his eyes before, the emptiness that had taken root in the hearts of all those who had fought too long, too hard. The battle didn't just take lives, it drained souls. It was the price humanity paid for its survival. Maybe it's not about winning anymore, Mara said. Maybe it's just about holding on? Maybe, Vance replied, his voice distant. Or maybe we're just waiting for the next big fight. Because the one thing we know for sure is that we'll never stop fighting. Not until there's nothing left to fight for. As if on cue, a red alert sounded, the klaxons blaring across the ship. Vance didn't flinch. He had learned to live with the noise, the constant interruptions, the cycle of war. He turned to Mara. Another day? Another battle? She smiled faintly, the same tired smile that had been passed down through every generation of soldiers. I guess so, sir. Vance nodded. All right, let's make it a good one. For them. For who, sir? Mara asked, eyebrow raised. The recruits, he said, a rare flicker of warmth in his tone. They deserve at least one battle where they don't get their asses handed to them. She chuckled, but it wasn't a happy sound. Right? And after that? After that? We keep going. Just like always. There was no answer to that. There didn't need to be. The war, like the soldiers who fought it, had no real end. The battle had been long, too long. The Zenari fleet was retreating now, but it didn't feel like victory. It never did anymore. Admiral Jonas Vance stood at the center of the bridge, his face an impassive mask as the crew scrambled to re-establish systems. The Relentless had taken its fair share of hits, and it was clear that while they had forced the Zenari to withdraw, the cost had been high. Too high. Mara Lewis stood next to him, her arms folded, a half-empty mug of something that wasn't quite coffee in her hand. Her face was as tight as his, a reflection of the unspoken truth they both understood. This wasn't just a war of bodies. This was a war of attrition, and humanity was beginning to run out of things to sacrifice. Another day, another retreat, Mara muttered, her voice dry. Same old song, different dance. Vance didn't answer right away. He was staring at the tactical screen, his eyes scanning the data like it held the key to understanding what was happening, what they were missing. The Zenari had been pushed back, but only temporarily. They always came back. The idea of a permanent victory felt like a myth now, one that had long since been discarded. This isn't right, Vance finally said, his voice low but steady. Mara turned, looking at him with a mix of curiosity and caution. What do you mean? Vance didn't answer immediately. He tapped a few commands on the console, bringing up more detailed readings. There it was, a discrepancy, something that hadn't shown up in previous engagements. They've been playing us, he said, his tone sharp. This wasn't a retreat. This was a feint, a distraction. Mara's brow furrowed. Feint? For what? They're still outnumbered. That's the point, Vance replied, his voice gaining intensity. They're not trying to win, not in the traditional sense. They're trying to wear us down. The realization hit Mara like a shockwave, and she took a step back, her expression going from confused to something close to horror. You think they're planning to exhaust us? Vance didn't need to answer. The answer was obvious. The Zenari had been throwing their forces at humanity for centuries, but it wasn't just about military superiority. It was about breaking them, breaking humanity's spirit, its resolve. They weren't trying to conquer Earth or the colonies. They were trying to make the fight so unbearable, so endless, that humanity would simply stop. Great, Mara muttered, rubbing her eyes, as if fighting to survive wasn't enough. Now we're fighting to keep our sanity. I never thought it'd come to this, Vance said, more to himself than to her. But they know us too well. They know we can't stop fighting. And they're betting that we'll eventually destroy ourselves trying to hold on to a fight we can't win. Mara's voice softened, her usual sarcasm replaced by something colder, more resigned. So, we just keep going? Like we always do. Vance looked up at her, a weary smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. You know what they say, Captain? When you've been fighting for centuries, stopping is the most dangerous thing you can do. The words hung between them, heavy with the weight of all that had come before. But there was more now, something Vance couldn't ignore. His mind was turning the gears, processing everything he had seen, all the patterns that were finally starting to make sense. Wait, Mara said suddenly, her voice tight. If the Zenari are playing the long game, then this isn't just a war anymore, is it? Vance's gaze sharpened. He had been thinking the same thing. No, this is something else. They're not just trying to destroy us. They're trying to erase us. A cold silence fell over the bridge as that realization settled in. The Zenari hadn't been trying to conquer humanity. They hadn't been fighting for territory or resources. They had been fighting for humanity's soul. And now, for the first time in 2 centuries, Vance realized that he might have been playing right into their hands. Erasing us how? Mara asked, her voice unsteady. Are they trying to wipe us out entirely? Not in the way you think, Vance said. They want us to disappear, not physically but mentally. They want to exhaust us, wear us down until we lose our will to fight. Once we're broken, there's nothing left of us to resist. Mara stared at him, her expression unreadable. She took a deep breath, as though preparing herself for something monumental. So they're going to keep pushing and pushing until we're too tired to care? Vance nodded grimly. Exactly. Until we've fought ourselves into the ground. Until the next generation no longer remembers what we're fighting for. There was a bitter irony in it, in the realization that the Zenari hadn't underestimated humanity. They had understood it better than anyone. They knew that humanity would never surrender, but they also knew that given enough time, humanity could break itself. Damn it, Mara whispered. We've been playing their game this whole time. Vance turned back to the view of space, his hands clenched in fists at his sides. And I'm just starting to realize how they've been winning without ever firing a shot. We can't stop now, Mara said, a new determination in her voice. We're too far in. We can't let them erase us. Vance's lips twitched into a grim smile. No, we can't stop, but we need to change the game. He straightened, his eyes hardening as the first spark of a new plan began to form in his mind. The Zenari had played them for centuries, but maybe, just maybe, it was time to stop playing by their rules. Captain, he said, his voice now resolute. We've been fighting the wrong war. It's time we fought smarter, not harder. Mara's eyes narrowed, her posture stiffening with renewed purpose. And how do we do that? Vance turned to her, a glint of hope flickering behind his tired eyes. We turn the tables. We force the Zenari to fight us on our terms. The war had never been about victory in the traditional sense. But that didn't mean humanity couldn't win. They just had to find a way to take back control, to redefine what it meant to fight and to survive. For the first time in a long time, Vance allowed himself a flicker of optimism. Maybe, just maybe, humanity still had one fight left in it. And this time, it wouldn't be a battle for survival. It would be a battle for their very future. The time for subtlety was over. Jonas Vance stood at the head of the War Council, the weight of the coming operation heavy on his shoulders. His plan had been set into motion, a calculated gamble that would either pull humanity back from the brink of total exhaustion or finally break them for good. The Zenari thought they understood humanity, but Vance had something they didn't: desperation and the will to fight for something more than survival. Admiral, are you sure about this? Mara's voice cut through the murmur of voices in the command room. Her brow was furrowed, her eyes sharp, but there was something in the way she spoke that made it clear. She was worried. Vance turned, locking eyes with her. It's the only chance we have, Captain. Either we take the fight to them on our terms, or we let them decide when this war ends. And I don't know about you, but I'm not ready to roll over just yet. Mara sighed, her shoulders stiff with the burden of knowing how high the stakes were. I'm not saying I disagree. It's a hell of a risk. Risk is all we've got left, he said, his tone level, though the flicker of doubt in his chest remained. We've been fighting for too long to keep playing it safe. It's time we give the Zenari a taste of what it means to have their backs against the wall. The crew's faces were a mixture of resolve and unease. They had all heard the rumors. Whispers of an operation so bold it could either turn the tide of the war or seal humanity's fate. No one had expected the Admiral to propose such a drastic maneuver, but there was no denying that this was the kind of fight humanity needed. Vance turned to the tactical board, where the latest fleet information was streaming in. The Zenari had already begun their preparations for another offensive, their ships amassing in the outer rim of the sector, poised to launch a new wave of attacks. They had taken humanity's predictability for granted, and now Vance intended to use that against them. "I want every ship in the fleet ready within the hour," he ordered, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had fought in the trenches long enough to know that the clock was never on your side. "We're going to hit them hard. No more distractions. No more feints." The officers at the table nodded in grim understanding, their eyes flicking nervously to the holomap. There would be no retreat this time, no backpedaling. If they failed, there would be no next time. Mara was silent for a moment before she spoke again, her voice softer. "And what about the future? What happens after this if we win?" Vance met her gaze. The question had been hanging in the air for a while now. After all this time, what would a victory mean if humanity had already given up everything else? But even with that looming uncertainty, he couldn't afford to dwell on it. There were no answers to be found in the question of what if. There was only the fight ahead. "We'll cross that bridge when we get to it," Vance said. "First, we have to win. That's all that matters now." The room went quiet as the plan was finalized. The operation was set, an all-out assault on the Zanari supply lines, their critical infrastructure, and the heart of their command centers. It was risky. It was dangerous. And most of all, it was exactly the kind of fight humanity had needed for centuries. As the meeting broke up, Vance made his way to the Relentless S command center. The ship was already buzzing with activity, the crew moving with practiced precision as they prepared for the mission. There was no fear in their movements. It wasn't that they weren't scared. They had simply learned long ago that fear was a luxury you couldn't afford in the middle of a war that never seemed to end. Mara followed him, her footsteps heavy with the same mixture of determination and doubt that had gripped her all morning. She caught up to him just as he stepped onto the bridge. "You really think we can do this?" she asked, her voice low. Vance turned to her, his eyes hard but not unkind. "I don't have a choice but to believe it." The countdown to launch began, and the ship rumbled beneath their feet as the engines powered up. Vance took his seat, fingers flying over the console, setting the course, coordinating the fleet's movements. The room was filled with the low hum of machinery and the soft beep of incoming data, but Vance's focus never wavered. This was the moment they had all been waiting for, the moment where humanity would stop being on the defensive, the moment where they would strike first. For a few minutes, all that could be heard was the buzz of comms and the steady pulse of the engines. "Admiral," Mara said, her voice urgent but steady. "The Zanari are already mobilizing. They're not going to give us a chance to strike." Vance looked at her with a grim smile. "Good. Let's give them hell." The fleet surged forward, weapons primed, shields raised. The battle began in earnest, but this time, it wasn't the usual skirmish. The Zanari weren't the only ones playing the long game anymore. Humanity had learned the rules, and now they were playing to win. The battle raged on, a brutal dance of fire and metal. Vance could feel the heat of the exchange even in the sterile confines of the bridge. Every impact, every explosion reverberated through his bones. But as the minutes ticked by, the tide began to turn. The Zanari's confidence wavered, their previously coordinated attacks beginning to falter. For the first time in centuries, humanity had the upper hand. It was a chaotic, messy victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. The Zanari fleet began to retreat, but Vance knew it wasn't over. Not yet. They would regroup, they would return, but for now, the galaxy had a brief moment of respite. Mara stood beside him, watching the ships pull back. "We did it, didn't we?" "For now," Vance replied, his voice heavy with both relief and sorrow. "For now." But in that moment, there was something else, something new. A spark of hope, however small, had been lit in the hearts of the soldiers, the fleet, and perhaps even the people who had forgotten what it meant to live without war. And for the first time in a long while, Vance allowed himself to believe in the possibility of a future where humanity didn't have to fight for its survival every single day. They had taken the first step. What came next, no one could say, but for the first time in 200 years, there was a glimmer of something more. Not just victory, but the potential for peace. But peace was a long road, and it was never certain. So, for now, Vance would take the fight to whatever came next because that was all he knew how to do. And with that, The Relentless flew into the future.